So one was my number, but like I said, I gained a wife happily. So sorry, go ahead.
Reading the book, it sort of became depressing how much they...
It didn't become depressing. It starts with a funeral, and then it gets more depressing from there.
But it became depressing how they sabotaged their career at every step.
That's true.
So you talked about the fact that they were willing to talk about it after some time had passed. Is there any regrets on their part with how much of that self-sabotage they went through?
I think Paul probably, as we were doing it, it was difficult for him. The first real formal interview we did was a real long one in a hotel in Bloomington where he had once worked as a janitor, so that already soured his mood. And then the next day, I went to his house, and he had this whole thing where he read me this letter, sat me down in his basement studio and said, "I'm going to read you this. You inspired me to write something." And I was like, he's like, and record it. So I started recording it, and I was sitting like, this close to him, and he said, "Not so close." And then so then he recorded this thing where he's just laying into me like, the fucking hotel you're staying in. He has the weird thing about hotels, and this, and you're looking to make me a villain, and this, which none of which was true. But he did this whole thing, and I'm like, okay, well, this is the part where he's just going to kick me out of his house, and this project is done, and this is the first interview. And then he just sort of took a sigh and said, "Okay, I've shed myself of that. What do you want to drink?" So it's like he has these kind of manic spells, and I think for him, he carries so much of the responsibility for the things that they did do that were bad, and the things they didn't do that the label and the manager didn't want from. So I think for him, it's been more difficult for a time. I think the reunion that they did in 2013 and everything that's sort of come out of that, the sort of validation of playing to 14,000 people in Minneapolis, or going the next week and playing at Forest Hills Tennis Stadium. There's 13,000 people just literally like levitating the place because they're singing their songs back to them. Even the most cynical, sort of unhappy person cannot be moved by that. So I think the reunion and people's response to that really sort of erased a lot of that for him. But as we were doing the book, and most of the interviews in the book were done prior to the reunion, I think he still carried a lot of that with him, because I think he felt he let a lot of people down, he let himself down, and not in any like financial way. I mean, he doesn't drive still, he doesn't go anywhere. He has a house that he bought, off his publishing deal, I'm sure 20 years ago. So it was never about the money. It was just the ability to do what he wanted, and he has that ability. But I do think if people have been telling you for 20 years, "Oh man, you guys should have been bigger," it does fuck with your head after a while. But when they are finally as big as everybody wanted them to be, and as we all thought they should have been, at least doing these shows, then I think a lot of that has been since dispelled over the last couple of years. But he almost did throw me out of his house. I got lucky. It was in December, and I, for whatever reason, I would do several interviews with him a year, at least 2. He always liked, knowing I was born and raised in Southern California, he always wanted me to come out in December and January. That's his idea of a show. And so the day that I went to, do the follow-up interview for the first big set of interviews, and he sat me down and read me this riot act. He said, I was going to have my buddy Jim Boquist, who he plays with, I was going to have him wear a suit, sunglasses, and just throw you out by the collar. Fortunately, there was like a blizzard that morning, and it was like minus 8 degrees, and he just said, "You know what? It's too cold for theater." So I got off. The book could have ended that day, but thank God for the shitty weather in Minneapolis. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So what's the closest they came to getting fired from the Tom Petty tour back then?
That's a funny thing. It's like everybody thought they got fired from the Tom Petty tour after Nashville. They played in Nashville, and the South always sort of, I think because they were fish out of water, brought out the best and the worst in Paul. So they had been opening this tour for Petty, which was pretty much a very bad idea and ultimately killed the group. Not necessarily because of Tom Petty. They got along with Tom Petty and his band, not so much with the crew. So they went, by the time they got to Nashville, they were playing the Starwood Amphitheater or whatever, Paul, they broke into the Heartbreakers' wives' wardrobe, and so like, you know, Paul's wearing a dress, Slim's wearing a dress, I think Tommy was wearing pink pants and like a turban, towel turban, and Paul's just razzing the crowd. He comes out with a giant thing of Jack Daniels. This is in Nashville, 1989, so it's like the most like broad petty audience. It's like the free-falling radio petty audience, and he just starts taunting. And you know, petty audiences, and I don't know how many of you have seen them in the South. Petty audiences in the South are much different than petty audiences in Chicago. They're like, you know, 1 degree removed from Lynyrd Skynyrd audiences. So even in Nashville, so Paul comes out, you know, with this giant thing of Jack Daniels, saying, "This is the only good thing that's ever come out of the state of Texas." And, you know, boo if you have the guts, and of course they booed him. And then I think that show ended with a 15-minute version of Walk on the Wild Side. And I think it ended when Paul asked for a drum solo from Chris, and he just threw the drumsticks away. So they, after that, they were on that tour for like 2 months. After that, just coincidentally, they had one of their only 2 like club dates, and so in Louisville or wherever, and so people got the impression, and it was been reported, you know, and that's one of those things I've kind of dispelled. They never actually got fired from the Petty Tour, but they just happened to be playing their a gig, you know, club gig the next night, so everybody thought, oh, they got fired off this, but they were back on the rest of that tour, and we're just doing. That's probably my favorite chapter. It's both the most depressing chapter because it's like, they got on that tour thinking we're so close to being like at Tom Petty's level, and then they realized no, we are not, because they were playing sheds at like, you know, 5, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, whatever. The sun was still out in August, and they would literally come out, and there would, in some places there would be like 200 people, 300 people in a 13,000, you know, capacity venue, and so that didn't do wonders for their egos. But yeah, they I think in Phoenix, they were playing somewhere, and they might have destroyed the dressing room. So for the next few nights, the bus was the dressing room. But you know, they were relatively, they weren't well behaved on that tour. But they never actually came close to getting fired. That's kind of been one of those sort of stories that's been debunked.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I actually worked at Norfolk.
Oh, you did?
Yes, I did.
What years?
80 through the fire.
Oh, right. Okay, so you're there.
So, you know, I was pretty good friends with Bob.
Right.
And I just wanted to say thanks so much for telling this story.
Oh, thank
It's
you.
really moving and amazing. Of course, no one who was there knew anything about that at all. But could you just talk more about how you kind of peeled back the onion of everything that had happened to him?
Yeah, the thing with Bob, I knew, because I knew the guys in the band, and I knew, you know, I was whatever, I don't want to say I was an insider, but I knew enough that I knew there was some pretty more serious darkness in in Bob's life than had been sort of indicated at any point. And for me, that was actually kind of the most important thing, because I thought the other stuff, it would come together. You know, Paul's creativity, Tommy's sort of, you know, survival instinct, and his rock star stuff, Chris's artistry, all that stuff. But the person who was like kind of the character that had been less developed for me was Bob. And I wanted to make him sort of three-dimensional. And, you know, I talked very extensively with his older sister. I mean, Tommy and Bob are actually half-brothers. And it was Tommy's, you know, father who sort of was the one responsible for most of the damage and abuse to Bob, which created an incredible dynamic where Tommy wasn't subject to that. And I think that says a lot about his energy. It's like when you escape that and it's all around you, it creates a different kind of thing, you know, growing up for him. But so for me, it was like the caricature is smoking and drinking Bob Stinson, wild and crazy guy in the dress, had all these excesses, got fired from the band, he disappeared as far as the public was concerned, died a very tragic death alone in his apartment. But I'm like, you know, there's more to the story than that. How do you get from, you know, this sweet innocent kid that you see in these pictures that are in the front of the book to the guy who, you know, dies alone in his apartment at 35? And so that was kind of, you know, I didn't know for sure I could nail that part of the story. I mean, I knew talking to his sister, and she talked about the abuse, and his mother did eventually. It was very difficult for her to talk about that, as you might imagine, because she felt a tremendous sense of guilt and responsibility, and, you know, but she was someone who got knocked up at 16, and she had to make a life for herself, and she always did the things she thought was best for her kids, moving to California to find a better life instead of the small town, you know, Minnesota life. And then when she realized what was going on, she got them out of there. But, you know, you're limited by your background too, and she was. So so for me, it was a huge part of it, and finding his story and those missing years away from his family, and trying to like reconnect with music. And there's stuff in the book where it talks about how that can help people who are subjects of physical and child abuse sort of reacclimate themselves into normal society. It certainly did for Bob, and he never let on about that, and he always sort of dismissed it, but eventually it caught up with him. I mean, he basically had kind of a schizophrenic break at the age of 25, right when they signed to a major label, and there was really no way, none of those guys, none of their management, nobody was really capable of dealing or helping with him, unfortunately. And I tend not to put as much blame on them because they had their own fucked up issues and all that stuff. But yeah, for me, that was, I don't want to say it was, I put more weight on it, but for me, it's like, that's why the story starts with his funeral, which is kind of the first Replacements reunion. It's the first time they were all together, and that's why I continue to go back to Bob even after he's out of the band, because so much of his sort of life force and his energy and the thing that him and Paul linked up about, this desperation to transcend their lives, that is the story of the Replacements in a lot of ways. It's sometimes that's maybe even more than the music, So thank you. That was kind of the goal. So if I did that, then I'm happy. Gentleman in the back, Marty.
Just out of curiosity, does anybody realize or connect that early fanzine of theirs, Willpower, to Smog/Bill Callahan, and he's almost even bigger than they were ever at their time?
Well, at one point. So Bill Callahan of Smog and Drag City artist, I believe he's still in Drag City. Great singer-songwriter, very strange, obtuse guy, apparently very popular with the ladies. He's had some very beautiful girlfriends.
But he had his heart into the Replacements on that thing from the 4 or 5 issues.
Yeah, when he was a kid, he did this, a relative kid. He was out of D.C. or Maryland. He did a thing called Willpower as a Replacements fanzine. It kind of a footnote in the story, and it would have been a footnote. Through a couple instances over the many years of doing this, I talked to Dan Koretsky at Drag City. I said, hey, does Bill want to talk about this? Because I'm doing this book. It's kind of just interesting. It won't be a big part of it, but whatever. And Dan said, nah, he's not interested. And at one point, I had his email, so I just emailed Bill. I said, listen, Bill, this is kind of funny. It might just only be a footnote or a little side note. And he was so appalled. He's like, I don't know if he was appalled by the fact of how much he was a fanboy of the band, but he's like, please don't bring that up. So I didn't. I actually did. It was in these footnotes that we cut, but maybe I'll restore at one point. And I actually quite like him. I quite like his music. He did an email interview with me once, which was the most insane thing I've ever done, because he's very creative. But yeah. So he's another sort of, I guess, one-time Chicagoan who had a Replacements tie, the only Replacements fanzine at the time, and went on to, of course, be a very successful independent artist as well. But yeah, he's kind of mortified by his Replacements fanzine past. James.
Yeah, there was a previous Replacements book a number of years ago that I don't see yours. What was your take on that?
A guy named Jim Walsh in Minneapolis wrote it. It was sort of done as an oral history with, I think, much more of a Minneapolis bent. It was about kind of the Minneapolis perspective, and also he didn't have access to the band. He was a contemporary of theirs, actually. He was in a band called REMS, R-E-M, before R-E-M, that would headline and then eventually open shows for the Replacements. So he's a good guy. He helped me with a bunch of research material. And I just think that was a different thing. It was an oral history, one, in terms of structure, and two, it didn't have, unfortunately, the input of the band. So, but I think in a way that allowed me, they realized, like, okay, people can do this. And so I spent a couple years trying to get Paul and Tommy to agree to be part of this, even though ultimately it would be my book to write and it wouldn't be authorized or anything like that. But I said, listen, if somebody's going to keep doing these things, you might as well be part of it and know that it's going to be a good thing. So that's kind of, but it's, it has its own merit, but it's a different, it's just it's almost more a kind of Minneapolis perspective on it. So
Recommendation for a good sound quality Replacements bootleg.
Why would you want good sound quality?
Why would you want good sound quality?
Classic.
There's all kinds of, there's a great collective of guys, I don't know if anybody's here from that, who put together like all these tape trading shows, and that was one of the things I did. I got like 300 Replacement shows and just listened to all of them. And by the time you get to by the time you get to 89, my buddy John Worcester is obsessed with the song Asking Me Lies, which was the Replacement's attempt at funk, bubblegum funk. And when you listen to like 60 versions of Asking Me Lies, you start to question your own sanity and existence in the world. But it was good to sort of hear some of the song pattern, but also it was a kind of, having all those bootlegs was a good way to sort of verify things. It's a funny thing you learn about memory. People can go to shows and swear to you on their mother's life that this happened at this show and this is what he said. And of course, when you listen to the recorded evidence, that didn't happen at that show, it happened at another show, and half of it didn't happen at all. So, so I was kind of used the bootlegs to sort of verify a lot of stuff. There's all kinds of shit. Shower and Shave. There's Beat Girl. There's the bootleg of this, which I don't even think it's a bootleg anymore because it was a radio broadcast. But again, fingers crossed, as part of the archival effort, we're working on trying to get some very high quality things that nobody's ever heard and nobody's ever been bootlegged out there, and there's a fair amount of that. So say your prayers at night that I can get these two guys' moods synchronized so that they can agree. You know, it's like the Replacements' relationship is like, I think I failed science, but it's like a sine wave. You know, it's like going like this constantly. And if I can just get them both at the peak, you'll have plenty to listen to down the line along those lines. So.